Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 9 of Daffy's Reptiles. Now, so far, we've covered some of the more common species. We've talked about leopard geckos, we've talked about ball pythons, and we've talked about some of the less common species like Leachianus and chameleons. But I wanted to really dig deeper, find like rare species that I've personally never heard of, maybe a lot of you guys haven't heard of, and I didn't really know where to go. So I started looking online, and I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I haven't even really heard of my guest until recently. I found him on the Gecko Radio Nation podcast, and I've probably heard that episode maybe 5 or 6 times so far. If you haven't heard it, go check it out. I'll put it in the show notes as well. It's a really good episode. But today I'm going to ask him a whole bunch of different questions, so you have something different to hear. And this is going to be definitely going to be a very interesting episode. So without wasting any more time, everybody, please welcome my guest for today, Wally Kern of Supreme Geckos. Hello.
Hey, buddy. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for coming on. You sound great. Yeah,
perfect.
Everything's perfect. Yes, thank you so much for coming on.
Excellent. It's my pleasure entirely. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, I'm very excited for this episode. I was going through your Instagram, and most of what you post I haven't even heard of. So I'm excited to learn a lot today.
Well, some of the names I just make up, so that's probably why you heard of them. We're probably going to talk about some of these scientific names. I get asked all the time. I get lots and lots and lots of messages on Facebook and YouTube and all over the place, Instagram. And people will say, hey, I have a skunk gecko. What should I? And my problem is I came from the fish world, so I'm very in tune with the Latin, genus and species name. And I grew up with that years and years and years ago. And it's just maintained itself because I made the mistake once of sending out a skunk gecko that was the wrong species. And that stuck with me too. So, while I know all the Latin names and everything, I try to use the common names because sometimes I'll listen to a podcast or a YouTube video and tarantulas, dart frogs, and some of these Latin names will start flying out. And it's just like, oh my gosh, I can't keep up with all these names. So I'll try not to get real technical with some of the names, but we'll probably cover more genus names and areas than real species names. So
okay, awesome. And that's very true because sometimes the common names, there could be multiple common names for one species, or multiple species could have the same common name. And I'm coming from the wrong side, fish world as well. So I'm completely comfortable. Yeah, so I agree with you. It could be a little complicated, but at least you're getting the right animal when you're talking that way. So maybe we'll bounce back and forth.
Sounds good. Sounds
awesome.
Good.
Okay, so let's get right into it. How did you get into keeping reptiles, and what was your first couple of species?
Ooh. Well, I'm going to go back 100 years ago because I'm pretty much that old. My family, I grew up in a really, really bad part of Wisconsin, and I got into a lot of trouble. And my family moved the family out to the county and onto a lake. And it was just such a different environment, but it completely changed my life. I think that I was 8 or 9 years old at the time, and I started fishing and catching bluegills and largemouth bass and all kinds of fish from this local lake. And I started keeping some of the fish to understand their behavior a little bit. A 10-gallon tank, a couple of bluegills and a bass in there, and just watch them and how they reacted. So I really got in tune with nature that way. From there, I started keeping tropical fish. Awesome. And in my 20s and early 30s, I think I had about 125 tanks from, 125 gallons down to little killifish and betta tanks of 5.
You're speaking my language.
That's my, if anything, that's my passion. I'm still really, really into the fish.
Oh yeah, they're beautiful. And killifish actually is most of what I keep. So you hit it right on the nail. Yeah.
So can we just talk killifish then?
We could. You want to do a whole
We'll come back to that.
We'll come back. Yeah.
So I kept tropical fish, and this is back before the internet and before there were any ways to really communicate on a mass method. So it was all newsletters and going to shows and auctions and sitting next to somebody and talking fish. So during that time, I learned a lot. I started shipping out all over the world and started raising some pretty rare fish. But our family grew and grew, and we had 3 young boys. And the third one was a little bit ill and spent a little bit of time in the hospital. And I spent a lot of time. And I had discus. I had 4 pairs of discus going at the time, breeding. And because of the hospital visits and everything, I would literally come home, throw food in the tanks, and leave. Came home one day, and I had 3 pair laying on the bottom of the fish tanks. And at that point, I said, I have 3 things going. My career, I was into computers and project management at the time. My family, of course, and fish. And I knew I wasn't, and I could only do 2. So I knew that
you can't give up the other 2.
I couldn't give up the family. So I had to make that decision. Do I really want to take this fish thing as a business? And I loved what I was doing for a career. So that weekend, I decided the next weekend, I wanted everything out of the house. We sold everything, all the fish, all the tanks, all the equipment, big blower in one weekend. We had people coming up from miles and miles to get, all these fish. So I cleared out everything one weekend and then had nothing. I tried orchids. I tried some other hot baseball cards. Nothing really took it. I had to breed something.
Right. It's the breeding that's addicting.
It's the breeding that's addicting. It's going in and seeing, a mouth brooder with a mouthful of baby or eggs. So that was the hook for me. So got out of fish for probably 10 years or so, kept 1 fish tank. That I knew that wasn't the way to go. Got into reptiles. So I started keeping a pair of leopard geckos. And if you know leopard geckos, on the way home from the reptile show, they're already breeding in the deli cups. They breed so easy.
Okay.
So that started that addiction. And I kept 1 pair of leopard geckos. And by the end of that year, I had dozens of pairs of leopard geckos, and I started keeping crested geckos, one of the most popular pets around, one of the most popular reptiles.
Yes.
Just loved it. I love the colors of the leopard geckos. I love the patterning and the morphs and everything, all the traits, I should say, of the crested geckos as well. So I was hooked. I was hooked pretty bad.
Absolutely. And to say that actually my story is very similar, and crested geckos are what got me hooked. And yeah, I'm still working with crested geckos as well. They're beautiful species.
I love them. And that was about 20 years ago.
Okay.
And I remember the story so well. I was getting into crested geckos, and I met up with a lady in Madison, which was about 50 miles from us, and she wanted to sell some of her collection. Went and picked up, I think it was 4 different groups. So 4 males and probably 8 to 12 females.
Wow.
And we made the transition, really nice lady and everything. And this is like 18 years ago. And I remember her saying this to me, the crested gecko thing is done. It's saturated. Everybody's breeding crested geckos. The market's going to fall out. And I was like, I just want to keep animals. I want to watch them and see kind of patterns and traits I can develop.
For the fun of it.
I want to have some fun with this. I really wasn't into the business. So 18 years ago, the prediction that the crested gecko market was done was far, far from the truth. It's really taken off lately.
Mm-hmm.
So I started making some money with the cresteds and leopards and started, reinvesting into the business and the hobby. But, probably like yourself, my interests change by, well, what time is it? My interest like that. I'll see something on the internet, or I'll go to a friend's house and see something, and it's like, oh, I've got it. So I started keeping micro geckos, and I started keeping some of the African geckos, and one thing led to another. My wife used to do daycare down in the basement. So she had half the room, and I had the other half for geckos. Well, she decided to go back to work. All of the kids that she was babysitting kind of grew up, and she didn't want to take in, younger kids. So I kind of annexed her half of the basement. So it was all mine, the whole basement.
Perfect. The dream come true.
It came true. So, my collection expanded by 2, and now I'm keeping all. I think I'm keeping over 60 or 70 different species of geckos. but I'm still keeping a lot of crested geckos because that's kind of where, I want to see my hobby move forward and try to develop different morphs and things like that. So I'm probably keeping about 60 different groups of crested geckos.
Wow.
I've gone down a little bit with leopard geckos. At one point, we were breeding probably 400 or 500 babies a year, but that's way down. But I'm really into the weird geckos that nobody knows the names of, and probably nobody cares except for me of what these things look like. So
I'll
that's
tell you
where I'm going now.
I'll tell you what I think it's slowly starting to change. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these species are smaller, a little bit smaller than crested geckos and leopard geckos as well, correct?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I think the hobby is starting to shift towards people are living in apartments. So they're even in the fish hobby, people are looking for the 5 gallons, 10 gallons, the nano tanks. And I think at some point, it's gonna hit the reptile world too, where people are gonna want that maximum an 18 with the small gecko rather than like needing a big tank for a bearded dragon or some other species. So I think you made the right move by moving into micros and some of the cooler species that you're working with earlier. I think you're maybe ahead of the curve.
It keeps my passion going, and I've always said, we talked about this earlier. Seeing babies is the driving force behind anything that I do.
For sure.
The first baby of a species that I just got, breeding it for the first time, reassuring me that I'm keeping them the right way.
Exactly.
Or if it's crested geckos, the first time I go downstairs and a crested gecko is hatched out and I'm not jumping for joy and excitement, I'm going to call it quits and just move on to keeping baseball cards again, I think.
You know what? I the same thing, and I've been keeping crested geckos for a couple of years now, and I was starting to tell people maybe it's time for me to experiment. I'm getting a little bored of the crested geckos, and then last week a crested gecko baby hatched, and I probably got on top of you're right. Once I'm not that excited, and it's not even just the babies, it's seeing the female grab it and then seeing her dig and then finding the eggs. Every little step along the way is beyond exciting. So I completely agree with you. Yeah,
that whole process. I know what you mean. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So should we start digging into some of these cool species then?
Let's do it.
Okay. So one of the ones that I see you posted most often, and by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this in the intro. I literally had to go through his Instagram and pull out names, and I was like struggling Googling them and trying. I've never heard of any of these species before. So maybe how did you start discovering some of the other ones? How did you move from crested geckos to the rarer ones first of all?
Sure, absolutely. And with the names, don't worry about it. I think that there's a lot of people that, are very uptight about the names. My feeling is if you can get it close, then, and I know what you're talking about and we're communicating, that's all
exactly
that matters. That's all that matters. And if, Paroedura Picta is one of my favorite geckos. If we can call it Picta or Pictus, or, the scientific name is Paroedura Picta, but if we can call it Pictus or Madagascar ground gecko, and we're talking the same language back and forth and sharing, that's all that, in my mind, that's all that matters.
As long as we know we're talking about the same animal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, I go back to the leopards and cresteds, and that lots and lots and lots of fun. But I think it was a show that I went to, again, probably about 15 years ago, and somebody had a gecko called Licodactylus Williams Eye. It's an electric blue, and they're just as blue as anything that you can see. It's just as blue as the
highlighter blue.
Highlighter blue, absolutely. And
yes.
And it's an animal that you can walk through a reptile show, and go from table to table. And that's a gecko. If you're keeping geckos, that's a gecko that will make you stop and really appreciate the colors of these animals. So I saw these, so I had to do all kinds of research, and I brought them in and started breeding them and just had a bunch of fun with it. And from there, it's kind of like collecting, again, baseball cards.
Yeah. Pokemon even, yeah.
Like Pokemon, like collecting jellyfish. Yeah. You start with one and you want to collect 2 or 3 or 10 or 20. So I started keeping the Licodactylus, which are just, they're only 2.5, 3 inches long. They're more diurnal. They're not nocturnal. They're out all the time. They're active. They're running around the tank all the time. Males will come up to each other and do the little head bob, and you can hear them talking to each other, and then they'll just hit each other, not violently, but they'll just tap each other and run around the tank. So the behavior is just amazing with these animals.
So you can keep groups together?
You can keep groups together in a big enough enclosure that they have lots and lots and lots of hiding spots so that they can get away from each other. So a male will be aggressive to another male as long as it can see the other male. But the second that that other male goes somewhere else, the first male, the dominant male, has his mind on other things. He's thinking about the girls at that point.
Absolutely.
So you can do stuff like that as long as you have a big enough enclosure. And it takes a little bit of time to learn, but that's the fun part of it. So I started keeping the Licodactylus and Gonatoides and Spirodactylus and all the little teeny tiny 2.5 to 3 inch. And I don't want to get into the names, but
sorry, I'm just going to stop you really quickly because that just made me laugh. I have 3 questions written down here. Have you ever I have all the species that I found on your Instagram, but then do you have any experience with Gonatoides? Do you have any experience with Spirodactylus? And do you have any experience with Stenodactylus? So yeah. Okay. So you do then. Okay, perfect.
I do.
Okay.
The good news with all of those I call them micro geckos, dwarf geckos, and there's a couple of really good sites on the internet that you can go to look up some of this information.
Sure.
But the good news is that they're always active. They're always running around. They're just the most beautiful, beautiful animals. They're not common in the hobby. So if you do get into breeding them, you're always going to have somebody looking for these animals. I get requests at least once a month for a micro gecko. And a lot of people know that I don't keep the micros anymore. And I'll get to that, the reason why in just a second. But
sure,
there's always demand for the micro geckos. And I keep a few of them, but not nearly as many as I used to keep. So the good news is that they're small. They're like dart frogs. You can keep, a small enclosure. You can keep lots of enclosures in a very small area. They're active. They breed easily, right conditions, and they're just beautiful, beautiful animals. There's one that has yellow and black barring like a bumblebee that's just Spirodactylus toriae.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really, really cool. The bad thing is that they're escape artists. So you have to have a really, really tight enclosure. You have to make sure that you don't have any holes.
So exoteras wouldn't work.
Exoteras won't work because the doors, open and close, and there's a little bit of a gap there. So you really have to find and if you make your own tanks, what a wonderful thing. But your tank has to have, no seams that are open, and then you have to have a top that goes onto the tank. So you have to pull the whole top out. Most of them are, a lot of them are terrestrial, and even the ones that are arboreal. As long as you're, going in one end and you're watching them, it's not too much of an issue. So one issue is that they're escape artists. Another is that they eat all the time. So the metabolism is just going nuts. So every day you can't really miss a day with these.
And is that because they're so active?
Because they're so active. They're just always active, which is really cool to see them running around. But you always have to have fruit flies. You always have to have micro mealworms. You have to have food constantly for them. And you go 2 or 3, 4 days, and you can really see the impact without feeding, and then you can see the impact of these animals. So,
interesting.
Escape artists, they have to eat all the time. They're hard to find. So there's some, pros, but there's also some pretty heavy cons. And they don't live as long as, we know that crested geckos and leopard geckos live 20 years-ish. These guys will go maybe 3, 4, 5 years at the most. So their lifespan, because they're small and high metabolism, is a lot shorter. So that's another con.
That's very interesting.
I'll tell you what, they're cool. They are cool animals.
They are definitely cool. I've been looking at them recently, and I agree. They are very cool animals. What about when it comes to eggs? How small are the eggs, and do they break easily? And how do you handle them?
So these little teeny tiny 2.5 inch geckos lay eggs that are half the size of a Tic Tac. So it's all little spoons and moving it to, hatching medium and special care. And you have to set them up so that when they hatch, you don't have them in deli cups with little teeny tiny holes. It's just that extra step that you have to take to make sure that everything's, set up the right way.
Which is what makes them a little tougher.
Makes them a little bit tougher, makes them a little bit, once you have one of them down, you kind of have all of them down. A little bit of UVB lighting, a little bit of heat, and it's pretty straightforward. But again, you can pack a lot of them into a very, very small area and keep them, again, kind of like dart frogs, like you're keeping dart frogs.
Right. Yeah, you can just have them like kind of lined up on a rack, and it's with tanks that small. How many can you fit on a rack? Like, yeah, that's true.
Exactly. Lots of fun. But I got out of the micro geckos simply because they take a lot of work as far as feeding. I mean, again, you have to be on them every single day. And the last few years, my job became quite a burden, on the family, on me, on the family, to the point where I was working probably about 80 hours a week for 2 or 3 years there.
Wow.
And my wife had to take care of the animals. So I knew that she couldn't be on the animals like I was.
Yeah.
So I moved the animals that I was working with to another person that could work with them a little bit better. And I moved into other animals that didn't take the day-to-day, every single day kind of maintenance.
Awesome. And now some of those animals are like the one you mentioned, the Paroedura Picta.
Exactly. One of my favorite animals. So I've kept probably 150 different species of animals, or species of geckos, somewhere around there. And I would have to say Paroedura Picta is probably my favorite. A lot of good reasons. They're just like leopard geckos, but you can keep them tropical or you can keep them arid. It really doesn't matter. They're in nature in Madagascar ground geckos, ocellated geckos. They go by 100 different names. Mm-hmm. But in Madagascar, the cool thing is that they live right on the edge of the tropical forest and I wouldn't call it desert, but the arid area, the rocky, sandy areas. So they can adjust very well to either a plain tank with sand and some hides, or you can set them up just like a crested gecko with a nice substrate, bioactive, lots of cork bark kind of hides.
Are they arboreal?
They're terrestrial, but every time I go in to work on that part of the room, every single one of the Paroedura Picta come right up to the front of the enclosure. If I have cork bark, they're up on top of the cork bark looking to see what I'm doing. Yeah. They're little prairie dogs of the gecko world.
That's incredible.
Big eyes, real cute animals, easy to handle, small size. They're only about 3.5, 4 inches at the very most. So about half the size of a leopard gecko. Mm-hmm. Easy to breed, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Easy to keep, just like I said. They're easy to feed. I've never had any of them show any signs of not wanting to eat, whereas sometimes you'll see that with leopard geckos, and crested geckos will sometimes go off food for a little bit. Mm-hmm. Picta are always little piggies. They're always looking for more food. So,
and what do you feed them?
Anything. I try to keep my fingers away from their enclosure as much as possible.
So anything as in, like, will they take, for example, rapashi, grub pie, or?
It has to be a feeder insect. So
it has to be alive.
A lot of crickets and mealworms and peanut beetles and gosh, oh my, everything that we have, any live food. I feed them a lot of dubias. Once they get to a certain size, we'll start feeding them baby dubias and, small dubias all the way up to adult size. So
very cool.
Not picky at all. The only bad thing with Paroedura Picta is that they breed super young. So leopard geckos, you really shouldn't be breeding them until, the females are about 50 grams, which can take up to 8, 9, 10 months.
Right.
Paroedura Picta will breed at about 4 to 5 months. So before we even can tell the males, they'll start breeding because males obviously know that they're males and they have one thing on their mind. Yeah. And the females being so small, that's really hard on the females. So once I get to a certain point of size or age with the Paroedura Picta, I start separating out the babies, so I don't have any females. I try to minimize as much as possible females that can become gravid. So that's the only negative with this animal.
Which means like you kind of have to have more and more enclosures because you can't keep them in groups at that age, at a young age.
Exactly.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, and
we do a lot of reptile shows. I'm online selling geckos, and it's so hard to keep Paroedura Picta available. You know, I hardly ever add a Paroedura Picta to the store because people are always asking for them. The neat thing about them is that there's tons and tons. It's just so early in the development of this animal. If you look at leopard geckos and all the different morphs that you have with leopard geckos and all the different color varieties and traits with cresteds, Paroedura Picta is right on the cusp of starting to see some of those.
Okay.
They come into, just like African fat tails, they come in two different varieties from nature, striped and reticulated. But I'm developing a really, really super wide stripe, pure white. It looks really cool. There's some, they're called T minus albinos. There's black eyes. There's triple stripes. There's some that are really orange. There's some that are just pure white snow looking. There's the possibilities are just unlimited with this animal.
I have a feeling I'm going to be looking for one after this episode. Yeah, yeah, that's very cool. So are they the same as the Pictus gecko? Again, we're using same thing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Paroedura Picta is the scientific name. If you call them Pictus, everybody knows what you're talking about. If you call them Madagascar ground geckos, everybody knows what you're talking about.
Cool. Okay. Very cool. And then, so you said you keep them on sand when you're trying to keep. Oh, so yeah. So do you keep them arid, or do you keep them like crested geckos? Actually, first of all.
No. You're right on. I keep them over sand. So I'm set up as a breeder. You can keep them over, just like you would keep them as a crested gecko. Keep them in a 12 by 12 by 18. Well, you'd want a bigger enclosure for cresteds, but you can keep them in a smaller enclosure singly, like that. You can keep them in a bigger enclosure in pairs, but you really have to watch the females and make sure. And once females start breeding, they'll just lay eggs constantly, like bunny rabbits. So the best thing to do is take out the males, after a little bit, so that the females get some resting time in there. But you can keep them over sand. As a breeder, I keep them in a 15 quart. I keep them on a rack, 15 quart sand and flower pot saucer hides with little V's cut out.
Right.
And some cork bark, water dish, food dish, some plastic plants. And the key with them is that when I go in, because they do need a little bit of humidity or they need to hydrate as well. When I go into water, to add water or change water once every 2 or 3 days, I'll add the water, but I'll lift up their hide and I'll add a little bit of water under their hide in the sand to keep that sand under their hide a little bit moist. And normally when I go in to look for eggs, it's kind of easy. I'll mound up the sand a little bit under their hide and I'll just go in, and when I'm ready to look for eggs, I'll lift up that hide and run my fingers through the sand, the moistened sand. And 99% of the time I find the eggs right in that one spot, buried in the sand.
They like the humidity for the eggs as well.
Exactly. If I'm not finding them under the flower pot, in the moist area under the flower pot, I know where else to look. I'll lift up the water dish and sometimes I'm a little messy with adding water and I'll spill a little bit. And sure enough, in the sand by the water dish, there might be some eggs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And are the eggs also Tic Tac sized, or are they bigger, like kind of a little bit smaller than crested eggs?
They're surprisingly scary big compared to the animals.
Wow. Okay. So
you see these little tiny, again, they're probably 2.5, 3-inch females, and they're laying eggs about this, almost the size of your thumbnail. You get a couple of eggs and you look at the eggs and you look at the female, you look at the eggs, look at the female, just shake your head like
where did those fit?
How did this happen?
Okay, that's very cool. Very cool. Okay, before we move on to more Picta questions, what's your, I guess you're keeping on sand, so you must have a specific brand of sand you like, or an opinion on impact. Like, I'm sure you've heard of the very controversial question, sand impaction and all of that. So do you want to maybe talk about that a little bit? How is there maybe a brand that you use, or like an opinion you have on this?
Yep. A couple of things. I'm highly opinionated on this.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
With leopard geckos, you should never ever use sand. But if somebody came to me and said, "Yeah, I've been using sand for 10 years, my leopard geckos are doing fine," I'm not going to raise the flags and post on Facebook, "Oh my gosh, I know."
Of course.
It is what it is. If you're successful with something, that means that you're doing everything the right way. And probably when somebody says I keep my leopard geckos over sand, it's probably a packed down sand. So it's more like deadpan than it really is sand. The key with leopard, I'm gonna go off on a tangent for a second.
No, here, go ahead.
The thing with leopard geckos is that, it's not so much the sand. A leopard gecko licks. A leopard gecko licks to take in minerals. That's just what they do. And they're going to lick anything that they can if they don't have the right minerals in their diet, or if you don't have something where they can lick to get all their minerals, their calcium, and so on and so forth. So all the time, keep some kind of a dish in your enclosure with a mix of vitamins and calcium. And what we do with our leopard geckos is at least, once a month, I'll take that dish, and if there's any remaining, I just toss it out and I add new. I mix my vitamins and calcium, and I'll just add that right in. Then I can throw the mealworms right in that dish, and they dance around and they get covered with the dust. So, but I know my leopard geckos are licking that vitamin and calcium mix to get their required nutrients. I think it's important with Picta, but I don't think it's as important. I don't think that Paroedura Picta, the Pictus geckos, I don't think that they're licking as much as the leopard geckos. But we've had them over sand for, 15 years or so, and never, ever had a problem. The only problems that I've had with Paroedura Picta, if I ever lose one, it's because I've not moved the male out from the female's enclosure, and the male gets a little bit aggressive. So, my practice now is, excuse me, just like the leopard geckos, I'll take them out, I'll introduce, a day in, 2 days out, a day in, 2 days out, a day in, and then that's it for the breeding season. If I'm not seeing eggs, after a month, I might start that whole process up again. But I try to keep them as much as possible away from each other. But in a Paroedura Picta enclosure, I've got them over sand, and I just never, ever have an issue with males or females getting impacted.
Okay, that's very interesting. And is there a specific brand of sand that you use?
Yeah. Yep. I'm sorry, you asked that.
No problem. Yeah.
I use Repta sand. Although I've recently purchased the Zoomed sand as well, and I'm trying that out from a recommendation from a close friend, a big breeder. So I think I think the finer sand is better. I tried play sand for a while, and that just kind of it clumped up a little bit too much, too many big particles in it. If you're going to spend your money somewhere, buy some halfway decent sand and get some Repta sand or something like that. Repta sand doesn't have the dust in it, so you can put it right in the enclosure. You don't have to wash it off. So, I'm lazy. Okay. I don't like to wash sand, so I throw it right in there, and it's virtually dust free.
No, that makes sense. And it's not washing the sand that's the problem. It's waiting for it to dry.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
No, that's awesome. I partially asked that question because I heard them ask you it on the other podcast, and I loved your answer, and I just wanted to hear you say it again and have everybody hear you say it. I think that's very interesting, point of view on it. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that, well, they're licking because they're looking for minerals. So if you provide the minerals, then why would they be licking the sand or anything else? And I recently got into Stenodactylus.
Nice.
Yeah, they're a cool species, but they're sand dune species, so sand is required. But I've never worked with a species like this before, so that's why I asked about the brand, because I'm curious to see what are the better brands to use, because they do require they burrow and they dig their eggs in sand as well. So I
think one of the things. Yeah, exactly. and I hope I gave the same answer tonight that I did.
You did. It was yeah.
My memory fades, and
no, that's perfect. I think it's a very good point that you make. It's exactly like it's exactly what's missing from the conversation every time it's made. Like, but why are they getting impacted, right? And to be fair, I've never kept leopard geckos, so I don't want to talk about leopard geckos, but I've kept newts and axolotls and those kind of species before, and it's also a common debate on that side, and I've never actually seen it personally. So
I think as a learning experience, you should go on Facebook in one of the leopard gecko groups and say, I keep my leopard gecko over sand. And I think that that's a really, really good idea. That's what I think you should do after this show. Go on and post that and see what kind of a response you get.
Have you heard of the term canceled?
Yeah.
That's what happened to me.
Permanent block. It's unfortunate. I think that on social media, a lot of people have, not everybody, I'm not saying everybody,
of course,
a lot of people have a very closed mind, a little bit of experience, and they get this defined impression of how things should be. And I talked to somebody that's been in this hobby for 30 years. I've been in it for 20 years, and I just made this comment on somebody else's show that I was watching as well. We're all learning, and he said the same exact thing. The day that I stopped learning, I should just hang them up, because we're all learning something new every single day. So everybody, whether you're, I feel very strongly that the sand isn't the biggest problem with leopard geckos. Keeping them over sand isn't, a sin. It shouldn't be done. You're risking, and I wouldn't. But if somebody is and it's working for them, I'm not going to be the person that says, well, don't keep them over sand. I'm a big believer that if something's working for you, you should keep doing it and show me what you're doing, so I can learn either what I'm not doing right or maybe what you're doing correctly, so that I can do it better myself. So that's
if it's not broken, don't fix it. Like, no, agreed.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
I absolutely agree with you. Okay, now that we went off on that tangent, back to the Paroedura Picta.
Sure.
Are they more of leopard gecko temperatures, or are they more room temperature like crested geckos? Do you require heat pads and all of that, or?
Great question. Wonderful question. They are just like leopard geckos. So we'll keep the back of the enclosure. I actually have two different racks that I keep them in. One, I have a heat cable on, and it's right directly on the back of the enclosure. So probably only 20% of the enclosure is warm, but I keep that turned up pretty high because it's not like a heat mat. But what I suggest to people is give them a temperature, of an area of about 20 to 30%, and give them a temperature of about 90 degrees, 92, 93, 89, 88. Doesn't really matter too much, as long as they have an area that they can self-regulate their temperature and go to and then come out of when they need to. That's what's important. And I think that a lot of people, I've been asked this so many times, do you keep your hide on the warm side or the cool side? It doesn't matter. It matters, but if you're keeping one hide, then you're doing something wrong. They don't have one hide in nature. They don't have one spot in the warm side or the cool side to go to. They have spots wherever they want that they can go to and hide.
Agreed.
Put a hide on the warm side, put a hide on the cold side, let them choose. And if they're constantly choosing the cool side, maybe put more decorations on the cool side. So I'll find them sometimes on the warm side, and I'll find them sometimes on the cool side. Do I try to figure out why they're on one side or the other? I don't. I just give them more choices so they can regulate however they want to.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So I think that pretty much covers my questions on Paroedura Picta.
Okay.
Maybe we can jump to so Paroedura bastardi.
Yeah, very, very good job. I always get the question: are they really called bastardi?
That was the first question I had written.
So these Latin names sometimes come right from the person that's discovering the animals, or they have different meanings. So Paroedura bastardi are just like Paroedura Picta. I shouldn't say it like that. Paroedura bastardi are very similar to the Picta that we just talked about, but they're more terrestrial. They're a smaller gecko. They're probably an inch smaller than the Paroedura Picta. They're more terrestrial. They like the leaf litter. They like to be down on the bottom of, if you have an enclosure with Paroedura bastardi, they're probably 99% of the time buried under something right on the substrate.
Very cool.
So I give a lot of how I do it, and I'm breeding a lot of Paroedura bastardi. It's an animal that's in high demand for us. It's a supreme gecko quite a bit. But I have a lot of cork bark that just has a little bit of a concave look to them, and it almost sits on the substrate, but it doesn't quite sit on the substrate flat. It's a little bit elevated off the substrate, and they'll go in there and hide, all the time in there. I give them the flower pots. They like the flower pots, fake plants, and so on and so forth. But they absolutely have to have some kind of a moisture substrate, some kind of a substrate that will hold moisture. So we do the Zilla Jungle Mix, and I just love that product. It's a good blend. Sometimes I'll add some sand to it, but most of the time I just throw it in the tank, and that does really well. Again, water dish, food dish, the same kind of hides, fake plants, and they do really, really well. The cool thing about Paroedura bastardi is that the adults are these little gray, kind of lumpy things. They don't have much color. Their babies hatch out, and their babies have this beautiful white and dark markings on the body, banding on the body, and beautiful contrast. The white is white, and their tails are as yellow as a banana. They're so good. So you'll hatch one of these out the first time, and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be a great little gray baby, and you hash it out and go, oh my gosh, and look at that tail and how cute the body is. So,
and all the colors.
Yeah, the baby's colors will just knock your socks off.
Okay. And you said they're in higher demand than the Picta. Why? Or sorry, you said they're in high demand. Are they in higher demand than the Picta? And why would that be?
Yep. Paroedura Picta breed, like I said, like bunnies. So we're producing a lot of Paroedura Picta every year. But you can still import quite a number of Paroedura Picta as well. So you can go on to a reptile show and see Paroedura Picta on somebody's table. It's probably going to be wild caught, which, has its problems. And it's probably going to be $25 for a Paroedura Picta. Bastardi aren't imported as frequently. They don't breed like bunny rabbits like the Paroedura Picta. So while we're breeding quite a number, I have a kind of a bigger group. I think I have 2 males in a 15-gallon. I have 2 males and probably about 6 females in there.
Wow.
And I'm
in a 15-gallon?
In a 15-gallon. Yeah.
How small are they?
They're about, I would say, half to an inch less than Paroedura Picta. So they're only about 2.5 inches.
2.5 inches.
2.5 inches, maybe 3 with their tails.
Like morning geckos, kind of. A little bit bigger than morning geckos.
A little bit bigger than morning. Yeah, that's a good analogy. A little bit bigger than morning geckos.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So they're still small. They're in demand because number one, not a lot of people are breeding them. Mm-hmm. Number two, they don't import as frequently as some of the other animals. And they're in high demand, I think, because you take a good picture of a Paroedura bastardi baby, and it kind of, for me, it just sells itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I haven't seen it, but just hearing the yellow tail and that sounds incredible. The banding and everything. Cool, very cool. Awesome. And then other than that, pretty much the same. Do they come from the same area? Are they also Madagascar species?
Madagascar. All the Paroedura, I believe, are from Madagascar. I'm trying to think if there are any that aren't. But they're found more, if we drew that line, where Paroedura Picta is, and we have the arid on one side and the tropical on the other, you get past the Paroedura Picta and you start seeing some of the Paroedura bastardi.
Wow.
The cool thing about this genus called Paroedura is that they have, I should know this, 24 or 25 different species, which I think there's only like 11 or 12 really in the hobby.
Okay.
One of them is Paroedura misobi, which is a black animal, jet black, with white spangles, with the biggest black eyes, very nocturnal, and they're big. They're for a Paroedura, they're big. They're probably about 5.5 inches.
And they're in the hobby?
They're kind of in the hobby. They're in Europe. They're being bred more in Europe than they are here.
It's always Europe.
It's always Europe. And you know why that is. In Europe, they take one tank at a time. Like I just mentioned, that I like lots of tanks and lots of but I can't focus on every single one and dedicate 100% of my time on 100 tanks. In Europe, they have one animal. They have one tank and one pair of these animals, and that's all that they focus on. So they make that one setup as perfect as they possibly can. They study that one animal. So I've traveled to Europe a few times and had the opportunity to talk to some people there, and they are, laser focused on keeping their animals the best that they can. And, fish, Germany, the same way. They're absolutely, laser focused on what they're doing over there. And we're collectors over here. And I think that, and I hate to say it like this, but I really think that the European community is more in tune with understanding the behaviors and the requirements and the behaviors of the animals.
Okay, that's very interesting. And do you think that maybe kind of has something to do with some of the information being available in other languages and not in English?
I think that could be. I think it's just a different mindset. I think that if you went to Germany and found somebody and talked to some people in Germany, and one person had that one setup and they're doing really well with one animal, and not to say that everybody just has one and they don't have 2 or 3 or 4. But you won't see the massive, breeding setups like we do here with the leopard gecko breed, some of the leopard geckos, some of the crested gecko breeds, and so on. I think it's a little bit language. I think it's also, that sense of community where if you did find somebody in Germany that had the leopard gecko breeding kind of setup like that, they might not be looked on the same way as somebody dedicated to keeping the 1 or 2 or 3 animals. If that
absolutely, like the hobby standard over there is no, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay, so Wally, I usually like to keep the episodes around 45 minutes, and we're already at 47, but I still have a bunch of episodes for you. So I have 2 questions for you.
Absolutely.
Hey, would you be interested in coming on for a part 2?
I'd love that. This is fun. Absolutely.
Awesome. I would absolutely love to have you on for part 2. And then question number 2, just because I have to ask you about this one more species before I let you go. And I'm actually going to have to pull up my phone for it as well, because I have all the species name written, but I can't remember which is which. And there's one that just blew my mind when I saw it. And it was pretty recently too. Oh,
while you're looking that up, I'm going to say I'll come on for episode 2 if you promise that episode 6 or episode 7, where we talk to each other, if we can focus on killifish for episode 6 or 7.
Absolutely. That sounds great. That sounds great. Are you still keeping any fish at the moment? I see an aquarium behind you.
Is it okay for me to move my camera?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
If you're watching on video, and I hope that I don't turn off my camera here, but let's see if I can do this.
Oh, you're still keeping a lot of fish.
Well, not a ton.
That's more. That's probably more than I'm keeping.
I only have, and I know your time is limited here, but I only have about, I only have about 20 tanks, and they're all 10s or 5s. And I have the one behind me, which I have that 30 right behind me that is empty with just some grow-up fish. But I'm keeping killifish and epistogrammas and shell dwellers, wild live bears and wild bettas. Those are the things that I really, really love. So
okay, I'm with you. I'm keeping killifish, the epistogrammas as well. But it stops there. The only other thing I'm currently the 2 other things I'm keeping are peacock gudgeons and the rice fish, the Medaka rice fish, I think they're called in Japanese. They're very cool species.
So we're like brothers here because I'm keeping the peacock gudgeons as well.
Are you okay? Wow. Seriously. So we're definitely gonna have to do a fish episode then.
We have to.
Absolutely, yeah. And I completely forgot where I was going with what I was
You're
But
gonna
I found the picture and then I closed it. But I at least I remember which one it was.
okay.
It is the Crytodactylus elok baby. I can even just.
Yeah. So
That is beautiful.
I tell you, having babies like that, I can I do a lot of wrong things downstairs with the hundreds of enclosures. Occasionally I'll do something really wrong and it'll tear into me for days. It'll be like, I can't do that. I can't be that dumb to do something like that. And I'm not going to get into details on this show. That'll be show 3 that we'll talk about all of my mistakes. But I tell you what, making a lot of mistakes or making a mistake that really is bad. You hatch out something like, Crytodactylus elok, and it makes up for a lot of bad things that happen because that is a beautiful, beautiful animal. So I had that animal about 5 or 6 years ago, and I got lots of babies. And again, business, it took me a different direction, and I had to give away a lot of animals. This last weekend, 2 weekends ago, I was able to get Crytodactylus elok back in our facility. I got a pair of them. So the parents they're just little brown, dumpy, poopy looking geckos. They don't have much. They have tons and tons and tons of attitude. Females are just nasty as all anything. But their babies, when their babies hatch, and the curly tail and the white and black, it makes it all worthwhile. Beautiful animal.
That incredibleness is just as the baby.
Oh yes, absolutely.
That's a little disappointing, I gotta say, but it is. I've never seen. It almost looks like a dinosaur in a reptile. Like I don't know how to describe it. The grays and the black banding on it. It's I showed the picture, but I'll post another one in the show notes somewhere for everyone to go take a look at it again. It's beautiful.
So hopefully at this time next year, I should start having some of my first babies, and when they hatch out, I'll have you here. We'll fly you in, and you can take a look at these babies live, and
I would love to do that.
Just like I do.
I would love. Yeah, I'll come jump around. We'll jump around together.
There you go.
That's awesome. Okay, Wally, thank you very much for coming on. I'll shoot you a message, and we'll plan a time for part 2, because I definitely there's loads more questions here. Like we didn't even touch the surface. But can you let everyone know where to find you? I know you're on YouTube, Instagram, all those places.
YouTube, Instagram, Supreme Gecko. Go to my YouTube channel. I post videos on geckos, and I'm actually really heavily into isopods, which sounds kind of nutty and kooky, but love the isopods. Go onto YouTube, and especially in the next month or so, isopods. In the next month or so, I'm going to throw out a real quick plug. I hope you don't mind. I'll take just like one more minute.
No, absolutely. No, yeah, do it. Yeah.
We've been doing something called the 12 Supreme Days of Christmas, and it's a big giveaway to other hobbyists. And the first year that we did this, about 10 or 11 years ago, it was all me, and I gave away like $200 worth of prizes.
Wow.
This last year, we gave away over $6,500 in reptile gifts from, I think it was 60 different people donating. So it's a fun event. It's all fun. And it starts at the end of, it actually starts the day after Thanksgiving and runs all the way to the day before Christmas. And every other day, we'll do an announcement and we'll do a giveaway, and then have a day of waiting so people can enter or do, post a picture or say Wally's a jerk or something on the YouTube videos or something like that. And we ask for participation, and then, the next day we draw names and people win. So it's a ton of fun. It's a great community builder. I see so many names, joining together and long-term relationships off of something like this. So make sure that you join, the Supreme Gecko 12 Supreme Days of Christmas event coming up.
I absolutely love that. I love the sound of that. Is that on your YouTube?
It is on my YouTube. It's on Facebook. Look up 12SDOC as a Facebook page, and you'll see all kinds of information. We're just now starting to get all the donations coming in. So
perfect. So I'm gonna make you guys' life easier. You don't even have to look on Facebook. It'll be in the show notes. Go look for it there. Click there. once this does start, you can look at my Instagram as well. I will be sure to be sharing all of this stuff as well. I love the idea. That's absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Wally, for coming on. We will be talking very soon.
My pleasure.
Very
Thanks, Fadi.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right, guys, that was episode 9 of Daffy's Roundtable. I want to say thank you one more time to Wally. That was an incredible episode. I learned so much, and like I said, I have so many more questions for him, so we'll definitely have him on again. Go give him a follow, Supreme Gecko. Follow him on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all those places, and keep an eye out for those 12 days of the 12 days of. I'm saying the name wrong, but you'll have it in the show notes. 12 days of Gecko Christmas, I think, or Supreme Gecko Christmas. Follow me on everything. I'm Daffy's Reptiles on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and then Daffy's Roundtable for the podcast. See you guys on the next one. Thank you.